When I was reading around this, thinking about the Rio Plus 20 conference, I came across what I thought was a really useful and very powerful piece of research. It was based on the Torres Strait Islanders, which is between Australia and Papua New Guinea, and what are still pretty traditional communities. And the researcher there had spoken to a number of what are called aunties, which are the female elders there. And these are communities that, like a lot of small island communities, are really seeing the impacts of climate change actually in action happening already. And this was what one of the aunties said to the researcher. You used to read the landscape, but now it changes. You have to guess now. You never know how it's going to change, like even the tide is changing. It's so hard now, guessing all of the time. And since about 2000, it's just getting worse and worse. Even the trees, you can see the changes in them. Even the fruits. We don't have a mango season anymore. And what you've got there is both women's knowledge and knowledge of the traditional indigenous communities, summed up in the words of just one person. And the other interesting thing that the researcher found when she spoke to both men and women, the elders on this island, was that it was the women who expressed the strongest feelings about what was happening. They were saying that they really felt loss, sadness, and a sense of powerlessness because all of these changes were happening and they didn't really understand why or what they could do about them or how to react to them. And I think that there's a lot of research from around the world from very different sorts of communities that show that women, generally speaking, are more concerned about climate change, and it's something that they feel much more personally. Yet, as Terry was indicating, if you go and look at the climate talks and look around the average table, you're not going to see that even vaguely represented. You know, this room here is exceptional, but generally speaking, this is a very unusual gender balance in a meeting about climate change. I think we know the reasons for that. And there's a couple of theories the academics have got very exercised about this in the way academics do, about why women might be more concerned about climate change. One is about their socialisation, that they're actually socialised to be more concerned about risks, so more, as carers, more concerned to deal with the effects of climate change. And the other theory is that their life experiences is because they're actually physically dealing with the actual realities of climate change, as that Torres Strait Islander has seen that the trees aren't bearing fruit anymore. But actually, and there's quite an interesting American study that tried to separate this out by looking at paid women workers and women who worked in the home, and to see if there was any difference in between those. And actually they found there was no difference at all. So I don't actually think it's really matters whether you divide those two things up. The fact is, you know, women's lives in general make them more concerned about climate change on average. Yet, I'm sitting here in what I think of as a very progressive, I think, broadly speaking, perhaps we might even say leftist environment. And what I generally find in those environments, people, when you start to talk about women and climate change or gender and climate change, there's some sympathy. You know, we understand that, you know, women are the more vulnerable people, the poorer people on average in society, and because of that they're more vulnerable. We understand that. But when you actually start to say there are gender-specific aspects to this, you very often encounter resistance. You know, the climate is the same for everybody, how can it be different? Now, it is worth thinking a second about why women are more vulnerable in terms of the figures. Women are about a third of the world's formal workforce, but they do 4/5 of the informal work in the world. Women everywhere on every continent, actually, when you put those two things together, do more work than men do. They, however, get 10% of the world's income. So more than 50% of the work, 10% of the income, and they own less than 1% of the property. So there is a huge basic, you know, inequality issue that applies to both men and women, but particularly strongly to women because women are more economically disadvantaged. But there is also a whole lot of ways in which gender affects the impact of climate change on women. The gender division of labour, physical mobility, access to information, decision-making powers, and there's even some biological differences that mean that climate change impacts differently on women. Just to run through that very quickly, because I don't want to focus on vulnerability for too long, but in the heat wave in Europe in 2003, there was a huge gender disparity, many more women than men died, which is partly the poverty issue in terms of women living alone, elderly women living alone and being poor, so either not having an air conditioner or not being able to run it. But there is also a fact that actually women past the menopause are more vulnerable to overheating than men are. There is actually a biological fact in there. But going back to the cultural things, in terms of the Asian tsunami and also the Bangladesh cyclone in 1991, huge numbers, I mean, there's no precise figures on any of these, but huge numbers more women than men died. And if you start to think about why that is, in many of these communities, communities affected, women are not allowed to leave the home unless they're accompanied by a male relative. If there's a crisis or a disaster coming, you can't go out and find out in the marketplace what's happening. You don't have access to information. You're often wearing clothes that may be more restrictive in a crisis situation. You often have children in your care, you know, if you're carrying the baby or whatever. And very often in many communities, the men may be taught to swim, but the women aren't. So if you start to look at all of those things, you can see how in disasters, in situations, women are much more vulnerable. So if we're going to be starting thinking about strategies to deal with vulnerabilities around climate change, then we very much need to ensure that we consider the gendered aspects, because if you're not doing that, you're really leaving some people behind and leaving them much more vulnerable than they need to be. Now, what I've just said is probably sort of quite traditional, and even most people will probably accept that. But I want to go much further and be much more positive, actually, because the women as the majority of the vulnerable approach fails to acknowledge, I was talking about with the Torres Strait Islander auntie, that women have huge amounts of knowledge, they have huge amounts of skills, they can bring they're agents who can come to the climate change discussion table and bring lots of stuff that men simply don't bring to the table. There are things that men don't know in all communities. The women, even the most vulnerable women we think of as vulnerable, they can teach all of us something about both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. There was a very good study done in northeast Ghana among the poorest women in a farming community. And these were the women who couldn't grow rice, because to grow rice you need access to a bullock and a ploughman, and you have to be able to pay cash to get them at the right time. And these women could only pay the ploughman by paying part of the crop over. So they were the lowest priority, so they couldn't get rice in time, so they had to grow other crops. But when the researchers spoke to this woman, they didn't use it in these terms, but those women had small plots of land, they were practicing expert crop rotation, they were practicing expert complementary plantation, whether you put plants beside each other that help each other grow better. They were getting every inch of productivity they could get out of their soil. They knew an enormous amount. And yet no one who was, if there might be an agricultural extension expert might come to the village and tell them things, but the chances of anyone actually coming to listen to them and find out what they know is very, very small. And yet that's the sort of thing, when we're thinking about adaptation to climate change, all of that knowledge that we're going to need to be able to access. And then we start to think about the sort of things that we're doing in terms of what climate change talks are producing. There's lots of talks about individual carbon allowances. But would we be considering things like cooking, cleaning and washing for children, for cases where women use energy, and overwhelmingly it is women who do it? If you're going to be producing figures and giving people budgets, are you going to be considering the gender difference there? If you look at, and this is an area where there's really grave concern, REDD, R-E-D-D, the reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Sorry, I always have to read it out, it's such a mouthful. This is a scheme that's been brought in that's supposed to be protecting forests and therefore reducing carbon emissions and locking the carbon up. But actually, lots of those forests are places where lots of often indigenous communities or poor communities rely on for their livelihood. And it's the majority of those are women. That's where they get a lot of their food, their medicines, their fuel, and there's a real risk that something like a REDD mechanism comes in and says, right, we've got all these rules. And if no one's asked the women in the community what they're using the forest for, and if those rules just suddenly stop it, even though what they're doing isn't actually damaging or seriously damaging at all, then we have to ask the women what's going on. So there's two arguments here. There's an equality argument that it's only fair and just that women who are affected or even more affected by climate change should be being involved in the negotiations. but there's also an efficiency argument. If you're actually going to have better climate talks, better outcomes from the climate talks, you have to have a fair number of women at the table. And the interesting thing is, if we go back, we're thinking that the topic of today is women and climate change, but we're thinking very much about the next Rio conference. And if you go back to the first Rio conference 20 years ago, the interesting thing is most of that Rio conference was really quite advanced in terms of women's issues. We've got Agenda 21, the Rio Declarations, the Conventions on Biodiversity and Desertification and Drought. All of those make real acknowledgement that there's women's issues attached to all of these. Unfortunately, it was the Framework Convention on Climate Change was the one that didn't include a real consideration of women's issues. There has been some progress since then. We're looking at the one thing I decided I wouldn't get a PowerPoint presentation, but there's one graph I would have liked to show you, which is the figures on the number of women represented in the climate change talks, and it's basically just hovered around 20%, 15 to 20% every time without going up significantly. And what we have as a situation was there's 6 constituencies represented at the climate change talks originally in 2009. We've got what you expect, business and industry, environmental organisations, local government, Indigenous peoples, which is good, the research community, and then in 2007 trade unions were added. And finally, in 2009, a gender constituency, and these are groups of people that have to be consulted through the process, was added, and just before Durban it got full status. And so some of these gender issues are starting to be considered, but there's some really, really, really depressing figures of very recent origins. There's a thing called the Adaptation Fund Board, which was set up in November 2010, just been set up basically. It's based in Germany, and it's deciding basically all the money that the developed states are putting in to help developing countries deal with climate change. It's deciding where the money goes. There's 16 board members on the fund and 16 alternates. And I just had a look at the website last night. Out of the 16 board members, there's 4 women, and out of the 16 alternates, there's 2 women. Now, this is something that was set up in November 2010. We're not talking about historical facts of, gosh, women were being left out. Women still very much are being left out of this whole situation. So I'll wrap up because I want to allow plenty of time for discussion. But the fact is, I think hopefully I've shown to you that there is a genuine gender aspect to climate change in terms of how it affects human beings, both in terms of the vulnerability, but also what women can bring to the table and what they can do to make the climate change talks both more equitable and actually just simply better. We can do all of those things. And I'd urge everyone in this room, we're all relatively privileged compared to most people in the world. It's up to all of us to work and fight on these issues. For people like the Torres Strait Islander auntie, who's probably not in a great position to do it herself. But let's try and bring that auntie along to a talk if we possibly can. Thank you.